Understanding the Pirc's defense. Tape 1, Side 1. Read by Michael Basman. Inventing a new opening system is not an easy thing to do for a start. The chessboard is a fairly small place, and though the possibilities on it are mathematically quite enormous, all the same, one would have thought that most of the sensible opening ideas available would have been tried. Certainly would have been tried out in about 100 years, which is as much as chess has been played intensively. In fact, though, innovation is still possible, and from time to time new methods of play are developed and take their place among the standard variations. In recent years, one such new system was the Pirc's defense, pioneered by the Yugoslav chess master in the 1950s and then developed by other masters in the 1960s. In particular, the books by Keane and Botterill did a great deal to popularize and disseminate the defense among the general chess public. Otherwise, its progress towards acceptance would have been much harder. What is this system then, the Pirc's, and why was it so late in being discovered? And what new ideas made it a playable defense after all? Well, we'll try and understand these questions in the course of this lecture, and I'd like you to have your boards ready in the starting position. First we'll play pawn to king 4 for white. This, as always, is one of the most popular opening moves, whereby white stakes a claim in the centre and threatens, by pawn to queen 4 next move, to take the lion's share of that part of the board, the central part. If you look at all the regular defences to this move, one pawn to king 4, you'll find that black nearly always does something to stake a share for himself in the centre. If he plays pawn to king 4 or pawn to qb4, then he has a pawn in the centre, and this hinders white's immediate plans to set up a two-pawn centre with pawn to queen 4. If, on the other hand, black plays one pawn to king 3 or one pawn to qb3, these do allow white to play pawn to queen 4, but on the very next move, black puts his foot in the centre with pawn to queen 4. Well, with his pawn on queen 4, black maintains a pawn in the centre, and he will then either exchange white's king pawn, or he'll just keep this solid foot in the centre, one pawn supported by another pawn. These were the most popular beginnings for black against pawn to king 4. The concept introduced by the Pirc's defense for the black player against pawn to king 4 was that you did not immediately need to challenge the squares in the middle of the board. You would eventually, possibly on move 5, possibly much later, but it did not have to be on move 1 or 2. Now, this concept of not occupying the centre with pawns, of course, is known from other systems against pawn to queen 4 for black, and also there are openings where white plays slowly in the centre, but there is a sort of understanding of a certain limit to how much leeway you can allow the opponent in the centre. And before the Pirc's, a player of the black pieces against pawn to king 4 would think that he would be allowing his opponent too much leeway in the centre if he allowed him to play pawn to king 4 and pawn to queen 4 without himself having a corresponding outpost in the centre. Now, let's follow the first few moves of the Pirc's defense. This is pawn to king 4, black pawn to queen 3, white pawn to queen 4, black knight to kb3. The black knight attacks the white king pawn, but itself it cannot be attacked immediately by white playing pawn to king 5, because if that happens, black will exchange the pawns, then the queens, and then play knight to king's knight 5, and on king's knight 5 his knight will attack white's kb pawn and his king pawn. So In answer to black's knight to kb3, white generally will guard his king pawn with knight to qb3. Black now plays pawn to king's knight 3. For a system that gives white a two-pawn centre so early, black must have some compensatory advantages. He is at present confined to the back three ranks, but he is developing his pieces harmoniously from this position. Both bishops have good diagonals, his knights seem to have squares for development, and black will be able also to tuck his king into a very good fortress on the king's side. Finally, black reserves his options for central play with pawn to king 4 or pawn to qb4 later. These will be his natural thrusts because he has a pawn on queen 3 which will be able to support either his k pawn or his qb pawn when it goes up to the middle of the board. And by playing in this way on the black squares, black will also be able to increase the scope of his black squared bishop, which he's fianchettoing on knight 2. For example, when he plays pawn to qb4, that will strike at the queen pawn, and this attack will be aided by the bishop from knight 2. Of course, this formation for black, again, is not entirely new. For 20 years, black's setup had been regularly employed as the King's Indian defence against pawn to queen 4, and this defence had enjoyed a good reputation. Now, to the position you have on the board, please add these two moves. Put the white queen's bishop pawn, which is at present on qb2, put it on qb4, and have a black bishop already on king's knight 2. This would be a standard position arising from the King's Indian defence. But why should the different placing of the QB pawn make so much difference, making one opening unplayable, and the King's Indian defence was considered to be playable, and making the other defence, which is the Pirc defence, very dubious? The reasons are twofold. One is positional. With a pawn at qb4, white's control of the central black diagonal is that much weaker, as his queen's bishop pawn no longer has the option of blocking the diagonal of the black bishop by, for example, going to qb3. And also white can never control the queen 4 square with a pawn. This therefore will give black a certain amount of play along this central diagonal. The second reason is that with pawns at qb4, queen 4 and king 4, white is expanding on the queen's side and in the centre. He could also play pawn to kb4 soon, but to put all 4 pawns in the middle of the board might be taking on too much responsibility. Now on the other hand, and now place the white queen's bishop pawn back on qb2, with pawns at king 4 and queen 4, white can play pawn to kb4 soon, and try and expand on the king's side and in the centre. The possibility of this king's side and central expansion is so much more dangerous, because clearly black's king is trying to find safety on the king's wing. Whereas you often find in the King's Indian defence that white expands and attacks on the queen's side, whereas it's black who is attacking on the king's side. And therefore the King's Indian games, the victories by white, are generally of a sort of positional nature, and they don't pose such an immediate threat to black. Well, actually it's not necessary to find more precise reasons for explaining the disregard which some opening system may fall under. Often it's a vague reason which is contained in many minds that leads to a consensus that this or that opening is unplayable. One particular fear of playing the Pirc, which did not prove to be fully grounded when people actually began to play the opening, was that white would be able to start a fairly automatic attack, rather similar to a dragon bashing exercise. Now, let me give you an example of this. let's go back to the start position. Just shove your pieces back to the beginning. Play the moves pawn to king 4, black pawn to queen 3, white pawn to queen 4, black knight to kb3, white knight to qb3, and black pawn to king's knight 3. Now white can play here pawn to kb3, black bishop to king's knight 2, white bishop to king 3, black castles, white queen to queen 2, black queen's knight to queen 2, and now white castles queenside. Now here white seems to have mobilized very rapidly and achieved the attacker's dream of castling queenside. His plan of attack is familiar from the Yugoslav variation of the Dragon Sicilian, and if you don't know anything about that, then you should listen to audio chess cassette number 6. The formation of the queen at queen 2, the bishop at king 3, plus castling queenside and pawn to kb3, is also a popular formation against the king's Indian defence. In fact, against any defence where black fianchettos his king's bishop. White's queen and bishop are lined up to infiltrate at king's rook 6, and his pawn has been put at kb3 to limit the action of black's knight at kb3. In particular, to prevent this knight from going to king's knight 5, attacking the white bishop at king 3, because clearly white wants to exchange that bishop for black's defending king's bishop, rather than for black's defending knight. Furthermore, white is all ready for a pawn storm on the king's side by pawn to king's knight 4 and pawn to king's rook 4. Now let's paralyze black for a few moves, and in that way we're going to get an idea of what white is planning. White wants to play, and you can make these moves without giving answers for black, pawn to king's knight 4, and then pawn to king's rook 4, pawn to king's rook 5, bishop to rook 6, white pawn takes knight's pawn, black plays bishop's pawn takes pawn, white bishop takes bishop, black king takes bishop, and now white queen to rook 6 check. Black king goes to knight 1. Now actually white cannot go pawn to, sorry, he can't go queen takes rook's pawn mate, of course, because there's a knight on kb3. He can try pawn to knight 5, in which case black will play knight to rook 4, and then maybe white rook takes knight. In this particular position we've arrived at, white's strongest move is a thrust with his pawn from king 4 to king 5. The point of this is that if black plays pawn takes pawn, white plays pawn takes pawn, and because there's a pin along the queen file, black cannot play knight takes king's pawn. So that means that black will either have to lose his knight on kb3 or move it and get mated. Well, in an actual game, black would have a lot more moves to defend with, or to counter-attack with on the queen side. But white's attacking plan nevertheless remains pretty clear-cut, and in that sense very attractive. And this, I think, was partly the reason why this defense was disregarded earlier on. People thought that white could attack fairly automatically. So many of the early games in the Pirc had to combat just such a system. Now let's look first at a 1958 openings manual, which is called Shahovsky Otvorenia, published in Yugoslavia by, of course, Pirc himself, the inventor of the system. And we'll see how black was tackling the problem of this white attack. I'd like you to return again to the start position. Now play one pawn to king 4, black pawn to queen 3, white pawn to queen 4, and black knight to kb3. These two moves, the knight to kb3 and the pawn to queen3, are characteristic of the Pirc defence. But perhaps even more characteristic of the formation as a whole are the moves black pawn to kn3 and black bishop to knight 2. And these moves can also be played on move 1 or 2 instead of moving the knight and the queen's pawn. But from a historical point of view, the moves pawn to queen3 and knight to kb3 came first. I think partly as a desire not to shock the chess world too much. I mean, moving out the knight to kb3 looks vaguely sensible and has something to do with the attacking in the centre. Whereas if you play something like pawn to king's knight 3 and bishop to knight 2, people would just disregard it as an irregular opening. And of course, an inventor of the opening, and Pirc would be no exception, will be looking to gain general acceptance by the grandmasters and masters of the chess world. So that's why the idea of playing pawn to king's knight 3 and bishop to knight 2 only appeared later, and in fact it has been named the modern defence by Keane and Botterill, and they wrote a book about it. All the same, in many ways the two systems are interchangeable, and in some way they differ. So we shall deal with the Pirc defence first, and then we'll see at the end of the tape if there's anything distinctive about the modern defence. Well, after that little digression, let's return to the game. White defends his king's pawn with knight to qb3, black pawn to king's knight 3, white pawn to kb3, black bishop to knight 2, and white bishop to king 3. Already in 1958 a fair amount of theory had been built up, and it was reckoned dubious here for black to automatically castle. Let's see the game Rossetto versus Matanovic, 1954 Olympiad in Amsterdam. Here black did castle at this point, and white began his attack, queen to queen 2. Black played pawn to qb3. The idea of this is to play pawn to queen's knight 4 and expand on that side. Now white played here king's knight to king 2, black pawn to king 4, and now white castled queen's side. No doubt white did not wish to castle queenside this early, as black also has a good attack. But now that black has played pawn to king 4, white senses a weakness, possibly along the queen file, maybe on the black queen 3 square, and this is why he puts more pressure on the queen file by castling. So white's castled queenside, black played now queen to rook 4. White pawn to king's rook 4, black pawn to queen's knight 4. White pawn to king's knight 4. The attack gains momentum. Now came black knight to queen's rook 3, white bishop to rook 6. He has a knight on king 2, so that's quite firmly guarding his queen's pawn. So he can play bishop to rook 6, doesn't need to bother too much about the centre. Now black decided to win this pawn, this queen's rook pawn. He played pawn to knight 5. White knight went back to queen's knight 1. Well, after a bit of a think, white decided he would not take this pawn at queen's rook 2 yet, because he clearly black didn't take the pawn at queen's rook 3 because he clearly didn't see a follow-up to his attack. So he played his bishop out to king 3. Now pawn to king's rook 5. This is all as predicted. Black bishop takes queen's rook pawn. White now comes through. Bishop takes bishop on knight 7. Black king takes bishop. White pawn takes knight's pawn. Now, here, if black captures with the king's rook's pawn, he's going to get mated in two by queen to rook 6 check and queen to rook 8 mate. So he must take with the bishop's pawn. This he did. And white played his queen to rook 6 check, and black went back to knight 1. At this point we see that white doesn't have the dislodging move pawn to king 5 because black has already got a pawn on king 4, so white must look for another way to try and eliminate that knight at kb3, and he played pawn to knight 5. Black played knight to rook 4. Now we can see one of the points of white bringing his knight out to king 2. It went now knight to knight 3. Black played here bishop from rook 7 back to bishop 2. Now please turn off the tape here and decide on your next move. Actually, in this position, white played knight takes knight here and eventually lost the game. Whereas if he had played rook takes knight, pawn takes rook, knight to bishop 5, he would have won a tout de suite. It was therefore reckoned at the time, in position A, that black should delay castling on move 5 and develop his queen side a bit more. In fact, to the move castles, Pirc gives a question mark. Now I'd like you to return to diagram A, and we'll have a look at some of the variations he suggests. Well, let's return to the start position, and we'll play pawn to king 4, pawn to queen 3, pawn to queen 4, knight to kb3, knight to qb3, pawn to king's knight 3, white pawn to kb3, bishop to knight 2, bishop to king 3. Now, let's see what we do instead of castling. One idea is to play pawn to queen's bishop 3. This is to prepare the queenside advance. White queen goes to queen 2, and black knight from knight 1 to queen 2. Here white could continue with castle's queenside. So let's see, we'll play this move, which is rather committal. Black still doesn't dare put his own king onto the king side, but brings his queen out to rook 4. Now we'll look at the game Pilnik versus Pirc, which occurred in Amsterdam in 1950. This went white king to knight 1, and black played knight to knight 3. I think it's possible instead to go pawn to queen's knight 4, but you'd have to consider an answer like pawn to queen 5 against that. Anyway, black played knight to knight 3 in this game, and now white played knight to queen 5. He gave up his attempts at attacking. Black now played queen takes queen, white knight takes knight check on kb6, black pawn takes knight, white bishop takes queen, black bishop to king 3. Now black has, according to Pirc, easy equality in this position because he can later play pawn to kb4. Well, let's now go back to diagram B and look at a subline which is mentioned by Pirc. And this is, instead of white playing knight to queen 5. He can play bishop to queen 3, black bishop to king 3, white queen to king 2, the black knight moves to rook 5, white knight takes knight, black queen takes knight, and white pawn to queen's knight 3. And here Pirc thinks the position is okay for black. He seems to be able to make some progress on the queen's side, probably by moving pawn to queen's rook 4 to rook 5. Now let's go back to the diagram A. Things become a bit more subtle. If black is going to delay castling, well then so can white. After black's pawn to qb3, white might play his knight from king's knight 1 to king 2. The idea being to transfer the piece onto the queen's side via qb1. We can see that white's move pawn to kb3 has denied his knight and its natural developing square, so why not transplant this piece while black has yet to commit himself. Now the example Pirc gives is Milits versus Pirc, Belgrave 52, where white moved king's knight to king 2, black played knight to knight 3, this threatens knight to bishop 5, seemed to be a favourite manoeuvre of Pirc's. White moved his knight to qb1, of course he could have played pawn to queen's knight 3, black bishop went to king 3, white knight to knight 3, black knight to bishop 5, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop. And white here played bishop to rook 6, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop, queen to knight 3, white castled queen's side, black played bishop takes knight, and white pawn takes bishop, which is supposed to be equal, and I suppose it is, because most of the minor pieces have been exchanged off and neither side has got a definite attack going, and also black's king will have a place to go to on the queen's side, because it looks like white has got some scope on the king's side. So you can see from this line why it was advantageous for black to delay the castling of his king. Another idea that Pirc gives for white is also interesting. I'd like you to return again to diagram A. Now, after black plays pawn to qb3 and white plays queen to queen 2 and black queen's knight to queen 2, white still doesn't castle his king, keeps it in the center, but plays instead pawn to king's knight 4. According to Pirc, this threatens the maneuver pawn to king's knight 5. If black goes knight to rook 4, white can play bishop to king 2, followed by pawn to kb4 and bishop takes knight. Well, this may be true, I'm not so sure about that, because anyway, black could surely put in a pawn to king 4 at a certain spot and maybe bring his knight to bishop 5 in some lines. But anyway, this is what Pirc says. Pawn to king's knight 4 threatens pawn to king's knight 5. But it may also just be threatening a kingside pawn advance with pawn to king's rook 4 and rook 5 and things like that. So, white's played pawn to king's knight 4. Now black plays pawn to king's rook 3. And here a game Matanovic against Pirc, Zagreb 1955 went. White pawn to king's rook 4. Black pawn to queen's knight 4. I think exclamation mark is given here because it was a very daring move to make. White plays knight to king's rook 3. Presumably here pawn to queen 5 didn't work. Black now played pawn to queen's rook 4, really advancing down the queen side. And white played pawn to queen's rook 4 back, black pawn to knight 5, white knight to king 2, black played his knight from kb3 to queen 2. His other knights had already gone to knight 3, so this queen's knight 3. So this knight from kb3 can go to queen 2. White rook to queen 1. Black queen to bishop 2. Now white moved his king at last. He plays king to bishop 2, and black pawn to queen's bishop 4. And please study this position for a while. This game was eventually drawn. Black, as we can see, has been able to expand on the queen's side, and his mobilization has not been hampered at all by having an uncastled king. So, already in the mid and late 50s there had been some considerable development of the defense, though it had not yet caught on in a big way. We'll have a look now at a more recent book, the 1970, about 1970, Pirc's Defense, written by Keane and Botterill. Cut! Having seen some black resources against a very natural attacking formation, that is the pawn to kb3 Yugoslav type, we shall now turn to another very popular formation for white, which we could call the three pawns attack. It didn't happen to have a name already. That is the Austrian attack. Let's go back to the beginning. Play pawn to queen 4 on move 1. Black pawn to queen 3. Yes, we can play it this way as well. Pawn to king 4 for white. Black knight to kb3. White knight to qb3. Black pawn to king's knight 3. And now pawn to king's bishop 4 for white. Well, we saw earlier that the move pawn to king 5 was not a very good thrust for white immediately, because black would just swap pawns, then queens, and then play knight to kn5. Well, now, reinforced by playing pawn to kb4, white can now threaten to play pawn to king 5, because then at least he'll be able to recapture with his bishop's pawn, and thus avoid the exchange of queens, and of course drive away the enemy knight. At any rate, black will have to think about what he's going to do if white pushes pawn to king 5, where he's going to put the knight. Shall he exchange pawns? Things like that. How much would his kingside defences be weakened if he allows white to play pawn to king 5 when black has castled? Now, to get an idea of the problems which might face black in this variation, we shall look at an example where black plays pretty passively, and thus white is able to build up his attack. So play here for black bishop to knight 2, white knight to kb3, and black castles. White pawn to king 5, and now black just retreats, knight to king 1. Now, this is actually diagram C. Let's look at a couple of examples of play. White plays bishop to e2, black knight from knight 1 to queen 2, white bishop to king 3, black pawn to queen's knight 3. Yes, he's got all the time in the world, so he thinks. Now white plays pawn to king's rook 4, black pawn to qb4. This is, at last black has thrust against the white centre. Till white plays pawn to king's rook 5, black bishop to knight 2, white pawn takes knight's pawn, and black rook's pawn takes pawn. Quite evidently here, black cannot recapture with the bishop's pawn because of bishop to bishop 4 check, which is very nasty. I'd like you to turn off the tape here and study the position. White's next play was pawn to king 6. A very interesting sacrifice, the idea of which is to render black's pawns unable to offer mutual protection, and thus provide entry squares for the white pieces on the king's side. After pawn to king 6, black played pawn takes pawn. White played bishop to c4, that is, sorry, bishop to qb4. And black defended this pawn by knight to qb2. White played now knight to king's knight 5. And at last black now felt he had to play pawn to queen 4, seeing no other real way to defend his king pawn. So he plays pawn to queen 4, but this is what white wants. He wants black to block the diagonal of his bishop from queen's knight 2. So after pawn to queen 4, white goes bishop to queen 3, hitting the king's knight pawn. Black defends, queen to king 1. White queen now comes out from queen 1 to knight 4. Another one into the fray. Well, if black had had a knight on kb3, but it was driven away, he could have prevented this move. Well, at least now he put his knight on kb3, and that attacks the queen, and also defends the rook 7 square. Knight to kb3 by black, queen to rook 3 by white, pawn to qb4, sorry, pawn to qb5, black played, bishop to king 2, bishop back to qb1, white queen to rook 4, and now black played his knight out to queen's knight 4, attempting to exchange off something, or at least perhaps bring the knight back to queen 3 and out to kb4. Now white here played his bishop from king 2 to knight 4, and as you can see, he has a very strong position. He's threatening to take the king pawn on king 6, and it's hard for black to fight back against this attack. Well, you can see how white was able to engineer this attack. Black didn't put up much opposition in the center, and white pushed through down the king's side, and you can see now he's got a queen and a rook on the rook file, and black is all but mated. Now let's return to diagram C. Well, the game we were just looking at was Bartok Plata of 1957. Let's anyway go back to diagram C, and we'll see another example of black's play, and here once again black suffers a bit from passivity. Now black has moved his knight back to king 1, and white played bishop to king 3. Last game he played bishop to king 2. Black now moves pawn to queen's bishop 3, white bishop to queen 3, black pawn to queen's knight 4, and here white castled kingside. He didn't go for the kingside attack. Black still tried to block things up to avoid white's pawn to kb5, and black here played pawn to king's bishop 4. White moved queen to king 2, black pawn to queen 4. Black's trying to block up the game as much as possible. White answered pawn to king 5. black played knight to bishop 2, white knight to king's rook 4, black knight to queen 2, white pawn to king's knight 4, black pawn to king 3. Now white moved his knight back to kb3. Not sure what that was for. Black moved knight to knight 3, white queen to king's knight 2. Oh, he moved his knight to kb3 because it was attacked, I see, by the queen on queen 1. Yeah. So white played queen to king's knight 2, black pawn to queen's rook 4, white pawn to king's rook 4. Black rook to rook 2, white pawn to king's rook 5. Black took the pawn, pawn takes king's rook pawn, white pawn takes king's rook pawn. And here black played king to rook 1. He's trying himself to get some play along the knight file, seeing that white has a queen and a king together. So if black can get a rook onto the knight file, he might even be able to pin. But it doesn't work out. White plays king to rook 1, black bishop to rook 3, and white knight to king's knight 5. White had much the better position here, with his firmly supported pawn on king 5 and his knight also nicely placed at knight 5. And in fact it's white who will eventually break through on the king's knight file. That game was Joppen versus Pirc, 1954, in Belgrade. So both those examples look rather bad for black. And we're now going to look at more modern play to see if black can get a reasonable game. Please return right back to the start position. We'll play pawn to king 4, pawn to queen 3, pawn to queen 4, knight to kb3, white knight to qb3, black pawn to kn3, and white pawn to king's bishop 4. Now let's continue with straightforward moves. We'll play bishop to knight 2, white knight to king's bishop 3, black castles, and white pawn to king 5. Now turn off the tape and have a look for yourself at the possibilities in this position. Now last time we had a look at knight to king 1, which might be okay if black follows up aggressively enough, but it wasn't in the games we looked at. Partly because black was defensively minded, whereas the variations we are going to look at show black with a totally different psychological outlook. Instead of desperately trying to save his king alone, which of course he must do, he is out to punish white for recklessly moving his pawns forward in the centre, and thus leaving his own king bare and naked in the rear. To enact this punishment, black must do all he can to liquidate white's centre, by thrusts such as pawn to queen 3, which he's already made, pawn to queen's bishop 4, and pawn to king's bishop 3. Played at the right time, these can be devastating, reducing white's little charges to a smouldering ruin. That's why we will not look at in detail at the moment the move black pawn takes pawn on king 5 for black, though there will be a discussion of it in the booklet. This move would involve black playing pawn takes king's pawn, white bishop's pawn takes pawn, and then black knight to queen 4, clearly endeavouring to exchange off a few bits. By that sort of tactic, black would clarify the position and let some of the steam out of it. However, if black is aggressively minded, he would much rather, if at all possible, keep the tension in the centre. That is, not exchange pawns, because this gives him more possibilities. In fact, we're going to look at the move knight from kb3 to queen 2, which Pirc gave a question mark in his book, and even in the supplement to his book published a year later of the latest variations, he gives it another question mark and shows the game Bronstein versus someone like Masiosi in an Olympiad, where white won the game. But in fact, the move knight from king's bishop 3 to queen 2 has become the most popular move over the last few years. Now the idea of moving this knight back to queen 2 is that black is going to play pawn to qb4 and then take off white's queen's pawn, and then with his knight and bishop trained against the king 5 square, he'll liquidate the other bit of white's centre, the king pawn. Now, you might wonder why Pirc regarded knight to queen 2 as a bad move in 58. I think the reason, again, is that it looks so risky. Because there were so many attacks involving the pawn sacrifice pawn to king 6. Now if you play knight to king 1, you've still got your bishop on qb1, and pawn to king 6 isn't going to occur. It did occur in one of the games we looked at earlier, but that was mainly because black next moved his bishop out to queen's knight 2. However, when you have the knight on king 1, it is rather passively placed. Its scope is reduced because of white's pawn at king 5, and also it doesn't help to undermine the white centre. It puts no pressure against the king 5 square. Now the other move, which we won't look at in detail after white's pawn to king 5, was to play pawn takes pawn, and I think this was another safety first move. As a rule, from a psychological point of view, an exchange of pawns in such situations is a coward's way out, unless of course the player has calculated that such an exchange can lead to a concrete advantage. But in this case the decision would be based on judgment or intuition. So let's play this move, king's knight to queen 2, and see if black can survive an even counter-attack from it. Now, to an extent, white has now burnt its boats, as black threatens pawn to qb4 here. So, assuming that white has got to go ahead, he has to have some ways of progressing, and the most popular moves here tend to be pawn to king's rook 4, a pawn to king 6, bishop to qb4, or knight to king's knight 5, or all of them. But we'll first look at the move pawn to king's rook 4, which looks the most attractive continuation. Now, after white pawn to king's rook 4, black attacks in the centre with pawn to queen's bishop 4. White pawn to rook 5, black pawn takes queen's pawn. Now, there is a sacrifice here of white playing rooks pawn takes pawn and black playing pawn takes knight, and this can be found in the notes, in the booklet. It doesn't actually seem to work for white. So instead of capturing, white will have to spend a move capturing the pawn on queen 4. Obviously he's going to do it with the queen, because if he does it with the knight then his king's pawn falls. So he plays queen takes queen's pawn. Here a natural move for black is to play knight to qb3. Let's make that move. Gains a tempo, why not? Knight to qb3, white queen back to bishop 2. Now white has lost a couple of tempos with his queen, but on the other hand it is now better placed and threatens to start a mating attack with queen to rook 4. Please study this position for a while, switching off. Well, it appears that black is in trouble. If he continues with pawn takes king's pawn, white plays rook's pawn takes pawn. Now black is unable to recapture this pawn. If he plays bishop's pawn takes pawn, then something awful happens. After bishop to queen's bishop 4 check, black king to rook 1, white rook takes pawn check, and things like queen to rook 4 check are going to be very strong. Knight to knight 5 check. So let's put the white bishop back on kb1, black king back on knight 1, black's pawn back on kb2. So we have white's pawn on now on king's knight 6, where he's just taken. Let's say that black plays rook's pawn takes pawn. Now white answers queen to rook 4. This is very unpleasant, because black cannot play knight to kb3 because of the answer pawn takes pawn. So he has to play rook to king 1, and we get our attack. Queen to rook 7 check, king to bishop 1, pawn takes pawn, followed by bishop to rook 6, which is very strong for white. Now I'd like you to return to the position of diagram 7. The diagrams in this tape are in a rather funny order, but this is because I wrote the tape in one way and then rewrote it in another. But anyway, I hope that they do not get you too mixed up. This is diagram 7. Now instead of the automatic tempo gaining move knight to qb3, black should play instead pawn takes king's pawn. This is far more realistic, because black really wants to be able to get a knight to kb3 as quick as possible in order to defend against white's threatened mating attack on the rook file. Now after pawn takes king's pawn, if white answers bishop takes pawn, I wonder what you would play as black. You should answer with knight takes king's pawn, because then if white plays knight takes knight, black plays queen takes queen, or if white plays queen takes queen, black plays knight takes knight check, or he doesn't even need to play knight takes knight check actually. But anyway, white cannot recapture. So after black's pawn takes king's pawn, white once again retreats queen to bishop 2. I'd like you now to study this position a little while. Now in that old 58 game which I mentioned of Bronstein's, and it is put in the booklet, black chose here the move pawn takes bishop's pawn, but this really helped white a bit with his development. For a start, his bishop came out from qb1 to kb4 and took an active part in the game. So this was why the variation was regarded as very dubious. However, later on it was discovered that black had a nice move here. He could play pawn to king 5. First sight, this doesn't look very sensible, because it just brings another white piece into the attack. White plays knight takes pawn, black plays knight to kb3 here. White knight takes knight check, and black pawn takes knight. Now white pawn takes pawn. At this point, black gives a check, rook to king 1 check. White bishop moves to king 3, and black rook's pawn takes pawn. Here black's play down the center files seems to be adequate, and also white's king is exposed. I mean, white cannot castle at the moment. Again, white is no longer threatening a direct mate, queen to rook 4 to rook 7 check. The black king can go to bishop 1. He only has to watch out that white doesn't then play something like bishop 5 check in some lines. Now I'd like you, after you've satisfied yourself with this variation, to return to the position of diagram 6. let's look at the second all-out attacking attempt by white. This involves the move pawn. Wait a minute. Involves the move pawn to king 5, black king's knight to queen 2, white pawn to king's rook 4, black pawn to qb4. So that should be the right position, yes, after black's pawn to qb4 on move 7. Here white plays pawn to king 6. Well, you might wonder what is the point of playing this move, but really it's concerned with the pawn structure. When white plays pawn to king 6, and say if black captures, then there are no longer pawns defending the king 3 square, so this is a likely entry point, and also there's less pawns defending the king's knight 3 square. So when white plays pawn to rook 5 and captures, say on knight 6, then the pawn on knight 6 is going to become weak. Before it had a pawn on bishop 2 defending it. So white will be able to bring his bishop out to queen 3 and attack this pawn. Also, white may play moves like knight to knight 5, and the king pawn can become difficult to defend. In general, any pawn that has to be defended by a piece is a weak pawn. Now, there's another aspect and that involves the doubling of the king pawns, the black king pawns on the king file. This makes communication difficulties. You see all black's pieces are on the queen side, quite a lot of them anyway, and it's not so easy to get them over to the, sorry, they're on the queen side, not so easy to get them over to the king side to defend the black king. So that is the idea of playing pawn to king 6. Now I'd like you to switch off the tape and analyze the variations which arise from white pawn to king 6, black pawn takes king's pawn, and now white pawn to rook 5. Well, I hope you did some work there. There are so many possibilities here that it is unlikely that your analysis will coincide with the variations we give. But that doesn't mean that your line is a bad one, and also it will help you to understand our variation. Now, instead of waiting for white to capture his knight's pawn, which could leave with black with a rather weak pawn at king's knight 3, black himself is recommended to capture with knight's pawn takes pawn. White rook takes pawn, black knight to kb3. This gains a tempo on the rook. White rook goes back to rook 4. White is now planning an advanced pawn to king's knight 4, knight 5, once again driving away the black knight. Black plays pawn takes queen's pawn. White knight takes pawn. Black knight to qb3. White bishop to king 3. Black queen to knight 3. Here we see chess in the modern style, or the Pirc defense in the modern style. Black is counter-attacking in the center and against white's queen's knight's pawn, and he'll certainly take that queen's knight's pawn if he's allowed, for this weakens white all along the central black diagonal, whereas black's bishop is placed here. Now after queen to knight 3, white plays pawn to king's knight 4, planning to drive black's knight away, and then if black's knight moves, white will be able to play his queen to rook 5, which will be something very near mate. Now black's answer to pawn to king's knight 4 is pawn to king 4, and in this position white's game is looking very shaky indeed. Now let's just go back a bit to diagram 8. This is a position after white has played knight's pawn takes pawn. White can also try to delay the capture rook takes pawn and play straight away bishop to queen 3. Why not turn off the tape and see what you think of this line? Now, if after bishop to queen 3 black plays pawn takes queen's pawn, white can possibly let that pawn go as well and play knight to king 4. Or if instead of pawn takes queen's pawn black had played knight to kb3, then white could himself play pawn takes bishop's pawn and then follow up with moves like knight to king's knight 5 and knight to king 4 to follow. Well, this sort of attack might give white longer term dividends than the desperate onslaught of the main line. Well, we've looked at the variation which white plays pawn to king's rook 5, black pawn to queen's bishop 4, and then white pawn to king 6. Let's have a look and see what happens if white plays pawn to king 6 immediately. Now, have you got the right position? White's played pawn to king 5, black king's knight to queen 2. White plays now pawn to king 6. Pawn takes pawn. And now again pawn to king's rook 4. Now, quite clearly, if black plays pawn to queen's bishop 4 here, he'll transpose into the earlier line. But he can also play differently with knight to kb3. White bishop to queen 3, and black knight to qb3. White pawn to rook 5. Here, knight takes rook's pawn looks maybe possible, but he makes a safer move in pawn takes pawn. Now white safeguards his important bishop at queen 3 from attack by playing pawn to queen's rook 3. That's to prevent black's knight going round to knight 5. And at this point, black produces a defensive maneuver, bishop to queen 2, and his idea is now to play bishop to king 1 and possibly bishop out to king's knight 3, or possibly just to use the bishop to defend the king's rook pawn. Well, in this position, white will be hard pressed to demonstrate compensation for the 2 pawns he's jettisoned at black. Now let us go back again to diagram 6. Let white play pawn to king 5, black king's knight to queen 2. Now there's another move here, knight to king's knight 5 for white. I'd like you to turn off the tape and study this idea. At first sight, this looks like a duffer's move, as the knight has moved twice in the opening, while there are other pieces undeveloped. But white wants to tempt black to weaken his king's position by pawn to king's rook 3, and besides he has some tactical threats based on pawn to king 6. So really white is trying to take advantage of black playing king's knight to queen 2. Now, in view of the threat of pawn to king 6, black has to move his knight offside with knight to knight 3. Now white continues bishop to queen 3, black knight to qb3, white pawn to queen 5. Black throws everything in. Black knight to queen's knight 5, white pawn to king 6. Knight takes bishop check, queen takes knight, black pawn takes pawn, and white pawn takes pawn. I'd like you to turn off the cassette here and study this position. Now white's pawn at king 6 is a strong wedge in the black position, and besides, white is threatening a rather crude but effective attack by queen to rook 3, and if black goes pawn to king's rook 3, white can play knight to bishop 7 and knight takes rook's pawn check. To defend against this, black must be prepared to part with the exchange, because he has certain positional pluses. For example, his very nice bishop at knight 2 and his good central pawns. So probably the best way for black to play is queen to king 1, white queen to rook 3, black pawn to king's rook 3, white knight to bishop 7, rook takes knight, pawn takes rook check, and now queen takes pawn. Well, black's given up the exchange, but he's got 2 bishops and an extra pawn, and he's certainly, I'd say he's got compensation for his investment of material. And white's king looks a bit open as well. Well, let's have another look at this position rising from king's knight to queen 2 and see if it really is as good as we've painted it. This is diagram 6, pawn to king 5, black king's knight to queen 2. We'll play here bishop to queen's bishop 4, and this again, same idea, threatens pawn to king 6. Now, have a think about this position, study it and decide what you think is going to occur. Against bishop to qb4, black answers knight to knight 3, and white brings his bishop back to queen's knight 3. There are notes in the booklet concerning bishop to queen 3 and bishop to king 2. Now black plays knight to bishop 3. He could of course play pawn to queen 4 to try and blot out white's bishop, but this again is sort of coward's way out, and anyway white will bring his bishop back into action by playing pawn to qb3 and bishop to bishop 2 sometime. So black has played knight to bishop 3, white has castled, and black plays knight to rook 4. Black here sets about removing white's main attacking piece. White knight goes to king 4, black knight takes bishop, white rook's pawn takes knight, black pawn to king's bishop 3. The undermining process continues in typical fashion. After white plays pawn takes bishop's pawn and black king's pawn takes pawn, you reach a fairly double-edged position. Black has 2 bishops, but again white has got more central control. His knights seem to be quite well placed. So maybe position is about even. Well, this last line, white dispensed with pawn to king's rook 4 and pawn to king 6, and he tried another form of attack, but then against this quiet method black seemed to have adequate resources. Now, so far the lines we've been looking at in this Austrian attack have involved white playing pawn to king 5 pretty immediately, that is almost as soon as black has castled. But in fact white can delay this advance. He's got a nice centre, so why not sort of develop naturally and advance later? So to do this, the most natural thing is to bring your bishop out. Now, in the old variations, white brought his bishop out to king 2, but this did have a drawback. So now more popular is to play at the bishop to queen 3. Still, first we will look at the variation where white plays his bishop onto king 2. This is from diagram 6. White plays bishop to king 2. Now the drawback of this move is that black can strike in the center with pawn to qb4. If white now captures, pawn takes pawn, which he does, black can play his queen out to rook 4. He doesn't need to recapture pawn takes pawn, thus allowing the exchange of queens, and followed by pawn to king 5, and white's got quite a nice looking endgame. So black plays his queen out to rook 4, and the idea is that he's going to play knight takes king's pawn next move. That is, if white plays pawn takes queen's pawn. Now this resource would not have been available to black had white played his bishop to queen 3. Now the game Fischer against Korchnoi, Candidates Tournament, Curaçao 1962, continued in this way. White played castles, black queen takes bishop's pawn check, thus regaining his pawn. Black king to rook 1. Sorry, white king to rook 1. Black knight to bishop 3. The position is resembling a sort of dragon variation of the Sicilian defense. Black's queen looks a bit exposed, but in fact it's quite well placed and does prevent the development of white's bishop to king 3. Black's last move was knight to qb3, and possibly better was to bring it to queen 2, and then maybe drop the bishop back to bishop 2, and the queen back to bishop 2, and the knight out to qb4 to put pressure against white's king's pawn. Still, knight to qb3 as played was okay. Now, white transferred his knight to the queen's side. He played knight to queen 2, black pawn to queen's rook 4, white knight to knight 3, black queen to knight 3, white pawn to queen's rook 4. All this is very similar to the classical variation of the dragon. Now white's pawn to queen's rook 4 is to prevent his knight from being dislodged by pawn to rook 5. However, black now occupied the queen's knight 5 square. He played knight to queen's knight 5. Very useful square for the knight, since it eyes the queen 5 square, which is always a weak spot for black in these sort of positions. At this juncture in the game, Fischer lashed out with pawn to king's knight 4. Now, he was only about 17 at the time. Please switch off the tape and consider this move. White's move, pawn to king's knight 4, turned out to be something of a disaster, for black now employed a little combination to wreck his game. He played bishop takes pawn, white bishop takes bishop, black knight takes bishop, white queen takes knight, black knight takes bishop's pawn. Very humiliating. White's rook at rook 1 is under attack, as well as his knight at queen's knight 3, so black will get back his sacrificed material with the better game. White played here knight to queen's knight 5. Black knight takes rook. White knight takes knight. And now it's 2 pieces against a rook, but white's position is also rather open. Black played queen to bishop 3 with a double attack. Well, sorry, it's a single attack actually. He's attacking the king pawn. So white played pawn to bishop 5, and now black played queen to bishop 5. Now that is a double attack. The rook on kb1 and the pawn at queen's rook 4. White queen to bishop 3, black queen takes rook's pawn, another double attack. This is against the knight at queen's knight 5 and the knight at rook 1. So white came in here, knight to bishop 7, black queen takes knight. Please turn off the tape here and study this position. Well, white could have tried knight takes rook here, and if rook takes knight, white could play pawn takes pawn, black bishop's pawn takes pawn, white queen to bishop 7 check, black king to rook 1, white queen takes king's pawn. And now if black tries bishop takes knight's pawn, white can play queen takes knight's pawn, attacking the rook and the bishop. However, Fischer didn't play this, and maybe he was trying for more, but anyway, from diagram 9 he played the move knight to queen 5. He's now the exchange and 2 pawns down, but he's got some attack. Black defended stolidly here with queen's rook to king 1. White bishop to king's knight 5 discovers an attack on the black queen and threatens pawn at king 7. Black played queen takes pawn, white bishop takes pawn. Please turn off here and decide on your move for black. Well, black could have played prosaically here, rook takes bishop, and then after knight takes rook check, king to rook 1, pawn to bishop 6, the black bishop could come out to rook 3, which also actually looks rather good for black. But instead, Korchnoi went over to the counter-attack by playing his bishop out to king 4. This is instead of rook takes bishop. Threatens a mate at king's rook 2. White played his rook to bishop 2, and black queen to rook 8 check. Sorry, queen to bishop 8 check. Rook to bishop 1, queen to rook 3. That's another mate threat. Pawn to king's rook 3 by white. And now comes another surprising blow. Black pawn takes pawn. Evidently, Korchnoi doesn't fear the opening of the king's knight file against his king. White played bishop takes rook, black rook takes bishop, white knight to king 7 check, black king to rook 1, white knight takes pawn, black queen to king 3, white rook to king's knight 1, black pawn to rook 5. White cannot increase the pressure on the king's side, so black just rolls his extra pawns home on the other side. The remaining moves we probably needn't go through. If you like seeing people being mated and destroyed, you can have a look at the rest of the game in the booklet.